the newsagents.
It has been a stunning fortnight of UK political news, one which we've of course savoured on the newsagents, and it has left us, uncharacteristically of course, rather breathless at times, perhaps a portent of the election year to come. It's meant that we've sometimes been unable to cover some of the equally important stories taking place around the world. Even in the last 24 hours, a wave of news from the Middle East and the ongoing horrors there in the Gaza-Israel war. Today, a glimmer of hope with the start of a pause, a return of some of the hostages, a deal, however short-lived, between the two sides. Meanwhile, in Dublin on Thursday night, O'Connell Street aflame after far-right criminals took to the streets to create unrest and disorder after a knife attack on school children. And in the Netherlands, the far right on the march again, though in a very different form, after Wednesday's general election, which returned perennial right-wing candidate Geert Wilders to pole position in the race to be the next Dutch Prime Minister. On today's show, we explain what you need to know about all three: disorder, disruption in parliaments, in the streets, in war zones, politics in Gaza, Tel Aviv, Amsterdam and Dublin. It's Lewis here. Welcome to the newsagents.
These are pictures from Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, filmed by our Sky News team. And as you can see there, the Red Cross convoy making its way out of Gaza. And you can hear there the Palestinians cheering, celebrating the release of these hostages, because of course the release of the hostages, this hostage deal, has also meant a moment of respite and pause in the fighting for them.
Right, we must start with Gaza. We are, 6-7 weeks into the horror. Israelis still counting the cost of that fateful day on October the 7th. Thousands of Palestinian families spending the week since counting their own cost as well, a cost which by the day has mounted. Exact civilian death figures are disputed, but no one can doubt that thousands have died, more wounded and maimed. Meanwhile, a new weird normal descends on Israeli politics, where the stated ends of Israeli goals are clear, the so-called destruction of Hamas, but where many doubt the Israeli means, the endless bombing of Gaza, can ever achieve it. On Friday afternoon, hostages were handed over as part of a temporary ceasefire mediated by Qatar. Palestinian detainees due to be released from Israeli jails in exchange for hostages held by Hamas. Both will include children. Channel 4 News foreign correspondent Secunder Kermani has spent much time in the region over this last 2 months. He's back in London and joins us on the newsagents. Sek, obviously this is the sort of first tentative sign that we've had today that there could be a glimmer of a sort of deal at some point and the first sort of proper cessation in fighting. How confident are you that it will be anything more or could be anything more than that glimmer?
Well, no, Lewis, I mean, it's hugely significant in that we seem set to see at least 50 Israeli hostages released. So that's a massive deal for those families and for the country. The deal could be extended further. We could see a further 10 Israeli hostages will be released in exchange for 30 Palestinian prisoners held by the Israelis every day. So, that in itself is significant. The pause in fighting is also significant because, you've had this huge, intense assault on Gaza with this, all the humanitarian crisis that we've been seeing unfold over the past few weeks there. So this is the first time that people have been able to have some kind of pause in order to regroup, to try and bury the dead. What the Israelis are saying is that it's not going to be an overarching ceasefire. They're very clear on that. They're saying that once this temporary pause in fighting is up, whether that's at the end of the 4 days, whether it's elongated by another few days, their overall aim of trying to, as they say, eliminate Hamas is still going to remain. And so, if anything, it looks like we've already seen this huge attack by Israel on northern Gaza. Now, though, the Israelis seem to be suggesting they're going to be focusing their military efforts on the south of Gaza. And they've been telling people in eastern Khan Yunis to flee to the west. So, I mean, this was already one of the most densely populated places in the world. So, I mean, many Gazans will be wondering, where on earth do we go? So, there's, as you say, a glimmer of hope, but it could well prove to be very short-lived.
The Israelis have been saying, and the Israeli government spokespeople have been saying, that the very fact of this deal, the very fact that it's happened, is to some extent a vindication of their strategy, in the sense that they say the intense military pressure that they've applied on Hamas has yielded the deal. Others have said that they could have had this much earlier, and that this is just Netanyahu and the Israeli government giving into pressure from, say, the families of the hostages, who have been very vocal within Israeli politics, understandably, over the last few weeks. Which of those is right?
Lewis, it's very hard to say. As you point out, there's been these two totally contradictory narratives. One is that this exact deal was on the table right at the outset of the war, but that Netanyahu and the rest of the Israeli government were reluctant to go for it. The other is that actually, which is what Netanyahu and his allies counter, they say there was discussions of a deal, but we never really felt that Hamas was serious about it, and they only became serious when we started applying real military pressure by launching the ground invasion. I mean, the ground invasion the Israelis did hold off by around 2 weeks. There was lots of people were asking questions about why that was, and we saw in that period we saw 4 hostages released by Hamas. But at that same time, I mean, there was also a very heavy airstrikes, continuous airstrikes being launched on Gaza. So it's really hard for anyone outside to decipher what the reality is. I mean, what's absolutely true is that pressure had been rising on Netanyahu. We saw this march from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem by families of the hostages, where they were calling for some kind of deal to be done.
Because you were on the march, weren't you? You were on that march.
Absolutely. Yeah. We spent a good chunks of time with some of the families as they were walking, and they were all quite clear in saying that they want the war to continue. I mean, there's a very, very few people in Israel right now who are calling for the kind of ceasefire that many people elsewhere in the world want to see, an overall ceasefire. Even the families of the hostages were saying, look, do a deal, bring our hostages back, but then go back and continue the war. I mean, there are a few who want to see an overall ceasefire, who think that there's no military solution. But the vast majority, even of the families, and certainly the rest of the population, wants to see this war continue. They see it as almost an existential battle.
And what do they say when you, as I'm sure you point out to them, but is the so-called collateral damage, terrible, horrible phrase, of all of these Palestinian civilians, children and so on, how is it worth it? Can it be worth it? What do they say when you say that to them?
Yeah, in Israel right now, a lot of people fail to understand, I think, why so many people elsewhere in the world are so angry at what is happening in Gaza.
That disconnect must feel profound when you're there talking to them about that, right?
It's really surreal. And if anything, they feel angry at Western media, just as many people who sympathize with the Palestinian cause feel angry at the media portrayal and feel that it hasn't done enough to humanize individual stories. Well, people in Israel get angry and they feel that Western media, in their view, is focusing too much, they say, on the suffering in Gaza and not enough on the aftermath of what people are going through after the October the 7th attack. There's this huge disconnect. And you get two responses, really, when speaking to Israelis. One is that some people say, look, it's sad. We don't want to see people suffering in Gaza, but ultimately it's Hamas who's to blame because they're the ones who started it. The other narrative, and actually quite a few people do say this, they say, well, yeah, it's sad, but what were Gazan civilians doing on October the 7th? They were celebrating, or they were handing out sweets, or they were, some of them came over and looted houses in Israel. Of course, there were people who did that. Well, there were many, many others.
And how, in terms of Israeli politics at the moment and Israel more generally, what is the feeling about what is going on, not just in Gaza, but in terms of the West Bank, where there's been violence? Hamas isn't in control of the West Bank, but also about what a ceasefire might mean in terms of Lebanon and Hezbollah and Israel's northern flank as well. At the start of the war, there was all of this concern about a potential extension, a sort of contagion of violence and fighting. Is that still there?
I mean, at the beginning of the war, I mean, there was a lot of people just speaking to kind of ordinary Israelis who were thinking about leaving the country because they really thought that you might see the northern front, the war with Hezbollah, totally blow up, and Hezbollah would be an even more potent fighting force than Hamas are. They're much better armed, much better equipped, much larger. But we've seen that. I mean, there's ongoing clashes. They're paused for now as part of this pause, although that wasn't formally agreed. But the clashes seem to have remained contained, with both sides showing a degree of restraint. And it seems that neither the Israelis nor Hezbollah want to really go to a situation of all-out war. Interestingly, one diplomat I was speaking to when I was in the region was telling me that the Israeli defense minister was really, really pushing at the outset of the war to launch a preemptive strike on Hezbollah because he thought, well, there's only a matter of time before they get involved, so better that we hit them hard first. And it was the Americans and Antony Blinken who put a lot of effort into reining him back and holding that possibility back. That could have been a very dangerous moment. That seems, for the moment, to be contained, although you never know what can happen, especially in an active conflict zone. What I think no one is talking about really in Israel, and there's a lot of international concern about this, is what's the plan afterwards? Okay, so the Israelis say their aim is to defeat Hamas. Say they are able to do that. We're not really clear exactly what that will look like because Hamas has been in charge of Gaza for so long. It's more than just a military movement. It's a political movement. It's a social movement as well. So what does it mean to eliminate it? But say they certainly remove it from power. What comes next? And what do you do when you're clearly going to have such a huge groundswell of anger in Gaza, given so many people, so many children have been killed? There was already so much anger in Gaza. Are you going to bring the Palestinian Authority in to try and take control of the Gaza Strip? They've been losing their credibility in the West Bank for a long time right now. The Israeli White Ring even considered the Palestinian Authority to not be a partner for peace, they say. A Palestinian Authority, for their part, I mean, it would look kind of very difficult for them to be rolling into Gaza on the back, effectively, of a Israeli invasion when there's, as I say, going to be so much popular anger, I would have thought. So, what comes next, I think, is going to be a huge, huge challenge and something that could define the kind of conflict and the region for many years to come.
Finally, Sec, knowing you as I do, I suspect that you, like me, do not like sort of particularly talking about or particularly enjoy it when journalists start sort of turning on the kind of woe is me kind of routine. But I'm interested in just your thoughts and reflections on what it is like covering this and covering this particular conflict, particularly at the moment. Because as you've already alluded to, Western journalists have become a kind of tool and have become a kind of centre of angst and political controversy themselves in this war, mainly because there are political actors who are keen, both within the UK, for example, and within Israel, to make them so. The challenges, what are your reflections on the challenges, the particular challenges of reporting on this war?
Liz, I mean, this conflict, more than certainly any other that I've ever covered, and perhaps any other that exists, is so polarizing. Passions are so high. I mean, anywhere around the world, people are talking about this right now, and people have very entrenched positions about it. I think most people have decided pretty much which camp they lie in, and so it becomes challenging because anytime you do a report, you face criticism, I think, from one side or the other, and criticism is always good, and it can kind of give you pause to reflect on whether you got things right, but you definitely always have that in the back of your mind, and it can make you better because you're constantly questioning yourself, and am I being fair, am I being balanced, have I done my due diligence on this? But it also can be quite unpleasant because you also can get quite a lot of abuse, and that's par for the course for journalists. But when you're seeing horrific images, when you're speaking to people who have suffered intense trauma, who've lost loved ones, who've seen loved ones being killed, Then to have people question the veracity of their accounts or to try and downplay their suffering, it's terrible for those people. It's really unpleasant for us to see it articulated as well. Yeah, it's at times it feels quite toxic, the debate around this.
Sec, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
500 people were involved in a riot on the streets of Dublin on Thursday night, which left the Irish police, the Garda, temporarily unable to restore order. It all started after 3 children were injured in a knife attack outside a Dublin school. Far-right social media chat was said in short order to have exploded, especially on Telegram, suggesting the man responsible was an immigrant or asylum seeker. They descended on the city and violence ensued. Police so far have not commented as to the identity of the attacker, but Ireland's police chief, Drew Harris, blamed the rioting on a, quote, lunatic, hooligan faction driven by a far-right ideology. This was Irish Prime Minister the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, responding to the riots on Friday morning.
Ask your sisters, ask your friends, ask everyone you know what they fear most on our streets. They're afraid of you, afraid of your anger and your rage, afraid of your violence, your hate, and how you blame others for your problems. As a government, we will be relentless in protecting our citizens and defending our people. The Gardaí will be on the streets in large numbers and will do whatever it takes to fight back waves of ignorance and criminality. The Minister for Justice will coordinate with the Commissioner to ensure we never witness such terrible scenes as the 23rd of November 2023 ever again.
Well, to try and understand what has driven all of this and the fact that, in fact, this is part of a little-noticed wider story in Irish politics, we can talk to Richard Chambers, Virgin Media political correspondent in Ireland, who was reporting at the scene on Thursday night. So, Richard, just in case people haven't seen, or even if they have seen, they've been rather surprised by it, just take us through where this has come from, because I think a lot of people, obviously perhaps not following Irish politics too closely, even in Britain, might have been rather taken aback by it. It's not something that we tend to see on the streets of Dublin.
No, it's certainly not. I think there's actually been an element of smugness in Irish commentary for the last number of years, particularly over the last number of months, that we didn't have the far right element that we've seen in other parts of Europe, that we hadn't seen, any sort of political party take hold with a far right anti-immigrant ideology and gain seats in the parliament. But it has been festering, and it has been something we've seen more and more of over the last number of months. Some high-profile incidents where migrant tents have been set on fire. There have been blockades at places, centres set up for people coming in who are asylum seekers or refugees. This has been something which has been building and building and building. And if you're monitoring the likes of Telegram and other social media channels where far-right people have been organising, this is something they've been crying out for a long time. So what happened yesterday, Lewis, is there was a stabbing in Dublin city centre, just off O'Connell Street, the main street of Dublin, outside a school, where 3 children were stabbed. An aftercare worker, an after-school worker who was looking after the kids, was also attacked. Now, people stepped in to apprehend the suspect. A delivery driver from Brazil used his helmet as a weapon to bring down the suspect and wait for Gardaí, the Irish police, to arrive. But immediately, as soon as word got out about this, online people were saying this was an unvetted migrant. This is what we've been warning about. This is migrants attacking Irish kids. And that really brought people out to the streets. So over the course of a number of hours, you started to see more and more familiar faces from the Irish far right gathering in Dublin and shouting abuse at journalists, politicians who had gathered to sort of, pay respects, and as well as, the Gardaí themselves. So this had been bubbling under the surface for a long time, but it completely combusted over the course of yesterday evening.
And there have been some, I can see even in British media over the last 12 hours or so, who have disputed the idea, from what we've heard from the Guardian, from the Irish police, that this was far right, rather than this was sort of concerned citizens or whatever. You would say that's completely wrong.
Well, it's provably wrong, in that a lot of the people who have been, known organisers of the far right, there are a number of different groupings in Ireland, who do organise themselves. They called people out onto the streets. This was an organised incident. This isn't something which just happened where people in Dublin just turned out and decided we're going to, set Garda cars on fire, set 3 double-decker buses on fire and throw bricks and cement blocks at members of the police. This isn't a spontaneous thing. There was an element of organisation here which Gardaí are looking at. The commissioner of the Gardaí said that there's an element of far-right radicalisation which has happened over the last number of months in Dublin. And it's hard actually almost as a journalist to just try and do this completely factually. I moved away from our live point where we were doing our TV pieces for Virgin Media Television last night just to have a look to see if I can get closer, because obviously you can't do that with a camera. So left all my gear and anything identifiable behind, and I moved down through some of the back lanes. So the police had blocked off a number of the main streets to try and funnel people away from harm's way. So we moved into some of the back lanes, and I turned from Henry Street onto O'Connell Street, which again, it's kind of like Oxford Street in London. It is the main street. And I was met with the sight of this towering inferno, this double-decker bus just in flames and exploding as the batteries in it cooked off against the silhouette of Daniel O'Connell's statue. Daniel O'Connell, a great liberator and a believer in emancipation of all men. And his image was used by a lot of the protesters last night, which just shows how historically idiotic a lot of them are. But there was just lawlessness on the streets. There were people running and screaming as, they heard loud bangs from the buses as they were exploding. People wearing balaclavas, obviously something which has a historical resonance in Ireland, on bikes and running and smashing up stores, and just really, I suppose, just taking advantage of the lawlessness that was there, because there were no police on O'Connell Street at that point in time, bar the Garda helicopter, which was circling above, spotlight illuminating all of the complete chaos that was unfolding beneath it.
And just in terms of concern among the Irish public, in terms of rising levels of immigration, asylum, and so on. I mean, how much concern do you think that there is, and how big a political issue has this been, irrespective of what the far right are trying to do about it?
Yeah, if you leave aside what happened last night, there has been a growing grappling of the immigration issue by the major parties. I think it's something that's been interesting to see that play out over the last number of weeks. There's been a number of political conferences taking place where people like Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, saying that, we need to stem the flow of people, particularly people coming in from Ukraine and other asylum seekers, that people are pointing to the stats that Ireland is taking in more per head of capita than other countries. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The Irish welfare system, in terms of what payments and supports are there for people who arrive from these war-stricken countries and what's there to help them to sustain a life in Ireland. The package that is there is seen to be, by some politicians on the right, as being too good, and that there's, just too many people coming in, that it is having an impact already when there is a housing crisis, the worst housing crisis in all of Europe, unfolding in Ireland. So it is something the political parties are getting to grips with. There is, and it has been, starting to show more in terms of opinion polling, that people are concerned about the volume of immigration in the country, but it is just on a completely different level. And there has been a widespread condemnation of what's happened last night. Even Leo Varadkar saying these people don't care about Ireland. These people who frame themselves as patriots are the furthest thing imaginable from that. These are people who had hate in their hearts, a gang of about 500 people who are intent on causing as much disorder as possible.
And Richard, just one other thing I wanted to ask you. Could you just explain, and again, people maybe in Britain might not be aware of his role in this, but explain Conor McGregor and his particular role in all of this?
I'm actually really glad you asked me this, because this is something which is now, I think, has been drawn fully into focus. So Conor McGregor, the MMA, former champion, although he's not really won a fight in a long time.
Mixed martial arts, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. UFC guy. Probably the most popular sportsman in the country, one of the most popular sportsmen in the world. But he has increasingly, over the last number of months, continued to push far-right talking points. And it was very plain to see yesterday, as the day wore on, he tweeted out things saying that Ireland was at war, calling people out onto the streets. And even people like Micheál Martin, the Irish Deputy Prime Minister, said that, this effectively amounts to incitement. I don't think there's been any real comment from him today. But when you have so many young men in particular in Ireland, impressionable young men, who look up to Conor McGregor as a representative of, a Dublin working class lad who's done really well, And, they see that fighting Irish in him and they see that as something that's inspiring. When he uses his platform to 10 million followers on Twitter and millions more elsewhere on Instagram and Facebook and whatnot to come out and riot, that's a very compelling tool for young men. And that is the makeup, really, of the crowd that we saw yesterday.
And as you say, Richard, finally, as you say, it's taken perhaps Irish politics or elite Irish politics maybe a bit by surprise, because there has been this sense that maybe Ireland, partly maybe because of its strong, robust economy and so on, has been a bit of an exception to the rule in terms of the rush to a certain type of polarisation that we're seeing in a lot of European politics, including British politics. Do you think that is now going to change? Do you think this is a bit of a wake-up call for Ireland, particularly as Ireland approaches its own general election, which must come no later than March 2025?
Yeah, I think so. I think this has shaken people awake. I think that there was an element of just pretending it didn't exist. We'd been thinking and been telling ourselves, patting ourselves on the back that we didn't have these problems, that Ireland was a welcoming country, the land of 1,000 welcomes. And that's just been shattered by what's happened last night. And the repercussions of this are just going to be felt for a long, long time. A lot of the people who have been out for the far right have said, because they've taken advantage of the homeless issue and the housing issue in Dublin, they've said, how's the Irish first, not the migrants. Well, the homeless suppers and super run, which focus around O'Connell Street and its area, they've been stopped now as a result of the stabbing last night and the riots that followed. Garda tactics in terms of managing this, there's been a softly approach. That's going to be reviewed now at this point in time. The political ramifications are going to be very interesting, Lewis, to see how they do actually pan out. Whether or not, you see that continued condemnation of what we've seen last night from the major parties, but some independent MPs in Ireland have been very, very slow to act or to condemn, disruption, disorder and violence when it's happened. So that's something to keep an eye out on.
Richard, is absolutely fascinating. Really, really interesting sort of turn in Irish politics that maybe some didn't see coming. Richard, thanks so much for coming on the News Agents.
Thanks so much, Lewis.
Right, when we come back, the far right on the march in quite a different form through the ballot box in the Netherlands. Stay with us. The wave of the populists, of the far right or the radical right, was supposed to have ended, or at least lessened. Tell that to the Dutch. Politics in the Netherlands has been dominated for 13 years by the rather moderate, bespectacled figure of Mark Rutte, the country's longest-serving Prime Minister. His fourth government fell apart earlier in the year over immigration, and he said he wouldn't stand again. He was widely expected to be succeeded by his replacement as the leader of the centre-right VDD, by his successor, herself the daughter of Turkish immigrants. But when the projections came in on Wednesday night, they sent shockwaves through Dutch liberal politics and Brussels as well. Who should unexpectedly top the poll but perennial anti-Islam, anti-EU, pro-Putin, radical right candidate Geert Wilders, a man who was once banned from entering the UK because he was considered to be a threat to public order. He has moderated some of his positions during the course of this campaign, but whichever way you cut it, his Freedom Party, the PVV, is a very different beast in terms of potentially taking over one of the founder member governments of the European Union. Again, concern with immigration and asylum gripping European politics in country after country, with so-called centrist forces appearing to have little to say, appears to have driven Wilders' unexpected success. To try and grapple with what's happening in the politics of one of our closest neighbours, we've turned to Pieter Haeck, an EU reporter from Politico. So, Pieter, where are we? We've had the election on Wednesday. The votes, I think, have now been counted. Has Dutch politics slightly taken its breath after the shock of the Wilders exit poll result?
Well, they had exactly 1 day to come to terms with the results, because yesterday nothing happened. But this morning, actually, there was a first exploration. The Dutch Parliament president, she gathered all the parties to see what the state of play is at the moment. And now the biggest party, the party of Geert Wilders, has appointed the first explorer, a scout, as they call it in Dutch politics, to see what the possibilities are.
And are there any possibilities? I mean, the only coalition which looks like it could be viable is, broadly speaking, a coalition of the right, formerly Mark Rutte's party, and this new centrist right political force as well, plus Wilders' party. Is there any possibility of a coalition between those forces?
Well, of course, that's now what's at stake. What is interesting is that the VVD, the party of Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, has already said that they don't want to enter into a into a coalition, but we do want to support a center-right government. So they're actually kind of flagging or signaling that they maybe want to support a Wilders-led coalition from parliament. So not as a government party, but rather from parliament, maybe in a minority coalition.
So to give Wilders potentially the votes to assume office, but not be in his government.
That could be the way how they do it. Of course, you then Wilders still needs to find support among his first possible partner is the centrist New Social Contract, which is like a new party created over the summer by a breakaway Christian Democratic politician. And another possible partner is the Farmers Movement, the BBB. So these are now the two partners that he potentially has to play with. And then, of course, you have like the VVD, who can the party from Mark Rutte, who like can support it from the party.
And just give a sense, how big a shock for Dutch political elites, for Dutch politics, would a Wilders-led government be?
I was in the venue where the Green Left Alliance, because they went to the elections together. I was there on Wednesday evening, and it was a total stunner because actually nobody had expected these results. Because even in the polls, the party of Wilders they were performing well, but they were not like in first spot until the very end. And then the elections results were a total stunner because he had a very big lead over the rest of the parties. So it was a total surprise on Wednesday evening.
And what do you attribute that to? I mean, many people think of, when they on the outside of the Netherlands, when they think of Dutch politics, they think of it being a relatively liberal country and so on. And yet here we are with Wilders, who has been around for a very long time, has adopted, although I know he's moderated some of those positions recently, but in the past has adopted some pretty extreme views and policies, particularly with regards to Islam and immigration. Mm-hmm. And he's talked about stopping immigration completely, potentially even EU withdrawal. Why do you think the Dutch public voted in the way they did, or why did he attract such unanticipated levels of support?
Well, of course, the Dutch politics was dominated over the past decade by one person, actually. That was Mark Rutte, the prime minister. And Rutte has always said that he doesn't want to play with the far right after his first cabinet fell because of the far right party of Wilders. So then he said, okay, I don't want to play with this party anymore. So actually, the party of Geert Wilders was never considered as an option to play in a coalition or to govern. And for many voters, that was a reason not to support Wilders, because they had the feeling okay, I'm maybe voting for a party that will never enter into a coalition anyway. But now that changed. Over the summer, actually, the new leader of the VVD has said she didn't rule out to work with Geert Wilders. So that was actually she was a bit opening the door, and that could have been the reason why many voters now have reasoned okay, he can enter into coalition. He's a viable option. And that's maybe the reason why he got so much support. And as you mentioned, indeed, in the past, he has had some very extreme positions, or although positions that were deemed unacceptable by other parties. For example, he said he don't want any Islamic schools. He doesn't want any Qurans. He wants a total asylum stop. He also advocated for an exit, for the Dutch to leave the EU, which would be a very outlandish thing, because the Netherlands is one of the founding members of the EU. So it would be very remarkable thing to do. But indeed, as you said, during the campaign, he has kind of taken a bit of a more moderate stance. For example, his agenda on the Islam, he has really toned down on that very hard. So,
and what has he said about Ukraine? Because obviously Rutte and the Dutch, quite similarly to the British, have been one of the most pro-Zelensky, pro-Ukrainian forces within Europe and within NATO. What is Wilders' position on Ukraine?
That's without a doubt the thing that will be the most contentious possibly now in the negotiations, because as you said, indeed the PVV, the party of Wilders, is not very much in favor of big aid packages for Ukraine, and definitely not military aid packages. Although he acknowledges that indeed Russia has invaded Ukraine. I mean, he's not denying that, but he's not a big fan of like these big military aid packages, which is completely different than, of course, the course that Mark Rutte has taken, because Mark Rutte, who's now also maybe a candidate for the NATO top job, and in the lead up to that, he was already like very much playing into this whole narrative, okay, of the West, of okay, we have to support Ukraine by any means necessary.
How do you think? Let's assume that Wilders is able to assume the premiership, is able to form a government and becomes the prime minister. How do you think that will change the Netherlands, both internally and externally as well? It will be quite a substantial change, certainly from Rutte, but also more generally, won't it?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I mean, the Netherlands has always been regarded as a very pragmatic country. They tackle the problems as they come. They're also very frugal. So it was always regarded as a partner that you can rely on. For example, I'm based in Brussels, and for the EU, the Netherlands was always a partner you can count on, that you can work with. And now I'm not saying that will change or something, but there will be definitely a more ideological take, maybe, because of course Rutte was always the one who said like, okay, if you need a vision, you have to go to an eye doctor, because I'm not giving you any ideological vision. So he was very pragmatic, but now they will debate very much ideological elements, like for example his whole Islam agenda. Of course, that's much more ideological. So that's something that will definitely change. And another element is, of course, we maybe have a prime minister who has said in the past, like, I want the Islam out of the Netherlands. That's a big question for anyone in the Netherlands who's not who's not like the Dutch standard, who's not from the Netherlands, who is an immigrant.
Muslims in the Netherlands must feel pretty uncomfortable right now.
Well, that's the reason why the Green Left Alliance has already spread the message like, if you feel excluded, we're here for you. So they are actually already like saying there is a big chance that a lot of people will feel excluded, and they're saying like, okay, we're here for you. We're here to make sure that you still feel included in this country, because they fear that a lot of people will feel left out because of this new stance of the new government.
Pieter, thank you so much for joining us. Really fascinating. Thank you.
Bye.
Fascinating, isn't it? Again, those forces of disorder everywhere responding to what they say is itself a form of disorder. Mass immigration, liberal states failing to create stability. I think it's going to be a theme of 2024. And Wilders is a great example of how the modern right across Europe and the West has morphed. How Wilders, in so many ways, is the mainstream right now. It's a story we're going to be following and reporting on more in the weeks ahead. That is it for all of us for this week, though. Unfortunately, John and Emily couldn't be with us today. They're in Stockton, accompanying James cleverly on a I Don't Think You Live in a Apology tour. John came up with the title. Remember, you can catch up with all our shows from this week on Global Player and send us story tips and feedback to newsagents@global.com. Thanks to our production team, as always, on the Newsagents: Gabriel Radis, Laura Fitzpatrick, Georgia Foxwell, Alex Barnett, Rory Simon and Arvind Bardawell. Our editor is Tom Hughes. It's presented by Emily, who you call in left-wing Maitlis, John, oh no, not another holiday, Sopel, and me, Lewis Goodall. We'll see you on Monday. Have a lovely weekend.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.